From here, let's go to slide 9. The Kuomintang, that is the nationalists who were founded under Sun Yat-sen, had a number of different leaders. The first one you see in a photograph here was named Song Jiaoren. That's Song Jiaoren. He was the assistant of Sun Yat-sen and a leader and founder of the predecessor to the Kuomintang, or the KMT, which was called the Tongmenghui. And he was a very vociferous critic of Yuan Shikai. But Mr. Song was, I think, what you might call not naive, but hopeful, maybe overly hopeful Democrat who did not have bodyguards. And when he was boarding a train to travel to Beijing, right after the election that his side won, he was assassinated in the train station by an agent, probably of Yuan Shikai, although there was never any way to prove this. And of course, you have to keep in mind that the system that existed at this time was not law-based. It was not based on gentlemen's agreements. It was pure power. And the people who had the power and had the gold made the rules. I guess you could call that the golden rule. Another one of the early leaders who did not survive was named Liao Zhongkai. That's Liao Zhongkai. He was actually born in San Francisco. His father brought his family there, and his father and mother had him there, but then returned to China. He was educated in the United States until I think the age of 16, and was also a founder of the Tongmenghui. He was a very strong advocate of close cooperation with the USSR and with the Chinese Communist Party, and was assassinated in February 1925. You can see him on his deathbed here in this photograph to the right. His son, who is at the left of that photograph, only died a few years ago, and he was a very prominent CCP underground official and diplomat. One of the things he did, for example, he was at the center of renewing China's relations with Japan in the 1970s, and he was also a very key figure during the Second World War in maintaining contact first with the British and later with other Allied forces. A liaison and Communist Party liaison department official for many of those years as well. Let's go on to slide 10. There were other KMT leaders. There were some nasties here. There were some people who were also a little bit innocent. Hu Hanmin was a people in China would say a fierce character. You'll see, by the way, on his photograph here, it says Hu Hanming with a G on the end. The misspellings in romanization are very common in China. It was true decades ago. It's true today. It's just something to watch for if you ever travel there, and that you shouldn't necessarily rely on the spelling of things. Anyway, as a founder of the KMT, he was on the party central committee and was accused of arranging the assassination of Liao Zhongkai. However, that was never proven. In the early 1930s, he began to become very critical of Chiang Kai-shek, the principal leader of the KMT at the time, and who continued to lead that party until his death. And eventually the two sides reconciled, but the reason that they reconciled was not because he suddenly became loyal to the Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek, but rather because he was too difficult to oust, which was a principal problem that the KMT faced throughout its time as the leader on the Chinese mainland, as the government of the Chinese mainland. They never were able really to fully consolidate central government control. They always relied for their authority on local figures who stood independent on their own turf from the central government. This was by no means any sort of federal system either. It was, again, a system that relied on the application of raw power to get things done without very much recourse to law, courts, elections, or anything like that. Wang Jingwei, who's pictured there right next to the swastika, probably this was taken at the German embassy in Nanjing in 1941. He was at first a very important military official, an early founder of the KMT, very influential, and wanted first to cooperate more with the Chinese Communist Party, and later he pushed for accommodation with Japan, saying that fighting the Japanese was a bad idea. And indeed, it took quite a while for the KMT to end up fighting the Japanese, which we'll get to as we go along. However, after open war broke out between the Japanese and the Chinese in July of 1937, he gradually defected, first traveling away from nationalist jurisdiction and putting himself close to the Japanese, and over time making public statements and eventually declaring that he was joining the government that was sponsored by Japan in Nanjing in 1940 as its leader. Zhang Xueliang, who we'll hear more about in a few slides from now, was the son of the warlord who controlled the Great Northeast, the Manchuria, and inherited that command after his father was assassinated by the Japanese in 1928. Zhang Xueliang his command was thoroughly infiltrated by the Chinese Communist Party, agents of influence, and after he was pushed out of Manchuria and into northern China by the Japanese and welcomed by Chiang Kai-shek to be on the Chinese side, he gave his loyalty to the KMT. At the same time, he became steadily distressed and dissented from the hardcore anti-communist stance of Chiang Kai-shek and urged him to reconcile with the communists in order to fight the Japanese, who had killed his father, of course, and had occupied his homeland of Manchuria. Eventually, there was a kidnap plot that Zhang Xueliang hatched and that failed, but it did result in the anti-Japanese united front that he sought. Let's go on to slide 11. So, Jiang Jieshi, Jiang Zhongzheng, Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek, all different pronunciations and ways of saying the name of the same person. He was known as the Generalissimo, or the Jimo, or CKS. You'll see CKS throughout these notes as an easy way to abbreviate his name. He was quite a figure. He was educated in Japanese military schools. He participated, not materially, but was a commander in the 1911 Xinhai Revolution that overthrew the Qing, and moved to become a close associate of Sun Yat-sen. He was fluent in Japanese and was a very good tactician, had a very solid command of military tactics. He became the commandant of the Nationalist Military Academy in Canton, that's Guangzhou, China, called Whampoa or Huangpu in Mandarin Chinese. He continued occasional contact with Zhou Enlai throughout his secret contact, throughout his time as leader of the Nationalist Party, and even when he was on Taiwan. Zhou Enlai had been his political commissar at the Whampoa Military Academy. So he was the leader of the Northern Expedition after Sun Yat-sen died, and dominated KMT politics until his death in 1975. Very pragmatic man, very cautious, and during World War II especially became the international symbol in the West of Chinese resistance to Japan. Go on to slide 12. So here we have a sample to give you an idea. Now you've seen a little bit of the nationalist Chinese figures. What about the communists? Well, everybody who studies a little bit about this knows about Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and we'll get to them in the next slide. But first, let's take a look at the early leaders who were senior to Mao and Zhou, at least for a time. The history of the Chinese Communist Party is interesting even from its outset. It was, as a group, acting like and functioning as a communist party even before its founding in 1921. It really got started in 1920, and it was started with the very close assistance of agents of the Communist International, that is, Russian agents in Shanghai. And the reason it was started in Shanghai is because that's where the workers were, and being close to the workers, close to the proletariat, is what being a communist party was all about, because these were the people you had to organize. So that's why they started off in Shanghai, and from their very beginning, they were a secret, conspiratorial, clandestine, underground organization. The two men you see on top were the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, and when they had their first party congress in July of 1921 in Shanghai, these two were present, as well as Mao Zedong, as well as an official from who had been sent by Moscow, not a Russian but a European, who was an agent of the Comintern. They were disorganized. They did not even put out ordinary security, and they soon had to change their meeting place when somebody walked in pretending to be lost, who turned out to be an agent of the French. The meeting place, which you can go see today, it's a very interesting museum and certainly worth your time if you go to Shanghai. The person who came in was a French agent. They were in the French concession at that time, and they were meeting there for the reason that they would be immune from the attentions of the local Chinese warlord. However, they weren't immune from the attentions of the French, who, like everybody else in the West, was not very happy about the Bolshevik Revolution. And it was, of course, known that the Bolsheviks were trying to put together a Chinese Communist Party. Some of the other people you see here are also quite interesting. Xiang Zhongfa, who's at the middle left there, was only a titular leader, a sort of a false leader during his time. He was a worker, not the sharpest pencil in the in the backpack, unfortunately for him. He ended up being arrested and tortured almost to death, and then shot when he refused to take Zhou Enlai's advice to leave the city and instead stayed overnight with his mistress, and was busted by the local police. Bo Gu, who was General Secretary during the early 1930s, was an intellectual figure. He was one of the people trained in the Soviet Union, and he had a long association with the Russians. A decade and a half later, when he was in Yan'an, and there was a political campaign going on that turned anti-Soviet, he was very upset about this and ended up volunteering his services to the local GRU, or Soviet military intelligence agent, who was openly stationed there as a declared member of the Soviet military intelligence, working as a liaison officer, and had secret meetings with him, and gave him a lot of inside information that would have gotten him shot, strangled, or otherwise done away with had the CCP authorities, the Communist Chinese authorities, figured out what he was doing. But he got away with it, at least for a while. He died in what people still consider to be a mysterious plane crash in 1946, along with one of the former heads of the Chinese Communist Intelligence Services. And Dong Bi Wu is another fascinating figure who is worth a biography in English that nobody has written yet. The oldest of the senior leaders. He had quite a background, and was and did a lot of complicated work for the revolution before 1949. Let's go on to slide 13. So now we get to Mao and Zhou and others. The people you see that you saw on the previous slide, some of them are a little bit older than this, but the people who were born in the 1890s and who came to age at the time of the May 4th movement in 1919 are generally referred to, and who became communists, are generally referred to as the May 4th generation. They were all outraged at Japan. They were suspicious of the West and of Western religion in general, and quite angry at the colonial powers in particular. And they saw the Russian Revolution as their great hope that would possibly change life in China and provide an opportunity for rallying the Chinese people to rise up against their oppressors. Let's go on to slide 14. So following the death of Yuan Shikai in 1916, leadership in the north was no longer so strong, but people were rising up in their own areas anyway. That is, local military strongmen were rising up, and they emerged in each region and began to consolidate their territories. This took a decade to occur, but by 1926 there was a discernible set of little kingdoms all over China that you can see here. Some people saw this as typical of previous Chinese eras of division, that is, the Three Kingdoms and Warring States periods in particular, 1,000 years before, as being precedent for this sort of thing. And this sort of thing, splitting up of China, is indeed one of the worst nightmares of the Chinese Communist Party today. That is, it's the sort of thing that in the Chinese press people warn about when they write. If we don't keep our act together, if we don't keep our ducks in line, if we don't follow the principles that have been laid down of the party retaining supremacy in political life in our country, then our country will spin apart and once again become a bunch of warlord kingdoms. This is not spoken about very much in the English language press, but indeed it is spoken about in the Chinese press. I'm going on and on here. I'm going to make this end this recording here and go on to the next one.